Hello, I'm Alison and I'm going to describe the relationships between Chinese students and their personal tutors. I'm going to give a brief summary of the study that I undertook for my recent PhD, and I will skip fairly quickly through some of the details so that I can focus more on the models that I discovered towards the end of the presentation. I used IPA, which is Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. This is a qualitative research approach committed to the examination of how people make sense of their major life experiences. So I used this to interview 10 Chinese students at Lincoln, 3 tutors of Chinese students, though not necessarily the same students, an administrator in our international office, and a tutor in the Chinese university that I've been working with. I asked the following research questions. So how do Chinese students describe their personal tutoring relationships in the UK? What is the experience of the personal tutoring relationship in China? And how does the personal tutor help students with their transition into UK higher education? And what can we do basically as personal tutors? That was my main point of interest, really, how we can better support our Chinese students. These were the themes that I discovered from the interviews. So I'll just allow you to read that for a moment before I move on to the next slide. So the statements were developed for each participant, and then I developed those into personal experiential themes. So these were themes that I discovered from the interviews. And then the group experiential themes are the ones where they applied to several students. A little bit of background about the personal tutoring relationship in China. There are basically 3 kinds, and I found that the literature that I examined in the Chinese CKNI database really concurred with what I found from my studies. So there's a class director who is responsible for around 25 students, and they look after things like the mental health of students, the future plans for study, any general information. Sometimes these directors teach their students as well, but not always. And they tend to be available for contact at any day, any time of day or night, often via the Chinese social media platform WeChat. So boundaries are quite unclear. They tend to just respond to student messages as and when students message them. They also have a political director, which we don't have in our country, which the Chinese tutor described as propaganda. And they really investigate and make sure that students are obeying the PCP. They then have an academic tutor, which is solely to help students complete their thesis. So this is fairly clearly defined, although it could be the same person as the class director, which does tend to blur the boundaries a little. These are some things that I found out about the nature of the personal tutoring relationship. I found boundaries was a big issue, and it was indistinct in both the UK and China. Some tutors disregarding the boundaries just to maintain positive relationships with their students. And some of the postgraduate students would visit their tutors' homes, so they had a fairly close relationship. I've also put on the following slides a few of the quotes from the student interviews that I did. The students appreciated the helpfulness of personal tutors, the speed of responses, and described them as being friendly, and they viewed proactivity as a positive. There were role conflicts in the role of the personal tutor. For example, tutoring students on their module, we don't know really whether that's positive or not. Some saw it as a positive, some wanted an independent person. So that's something to really consider. In terms of contact, tutors noted more frequent contact with their Chinese students, but it could be on any format like emails, face-to-face, Teams, telephone, or WeChat. Some of them reported a close relationship, some more transactional, and some just non-existent, didn't know that their tutor existed. On this slide, I've outlined some of the expectations of the relationship that I found, that students learn about the personal tutor before they start at university and what they expect from that. So they're given general information, they're told that they will have a personal tutor who is described as a go-to point. Most expected academic support and the desire to be pushed, the desire for a subject specialist, although again some preferred an independent person. In terms of personal support, they expect help with personal issues, proactivity is seen as a bonus, and they also aspire a close relationship with a personal tutor. The frequency and speed of contact was students desired fast responses and more contact, often outside working hours, particularly in China. And the tutor that I spoke to in China described it as a cold rejection if she didn't respond to her tutee's messages at, for example, 3 a.m. So there were different expectations between the UK and China, and it was reported that more was expected from Chinese tutors than from their UK personal tutors. The biggest barrier I found to the relationships was perceptions of tutor availability. Students just felt that they didn't want to bother their tutor, so they'd rather ask their friends or manage situations themselves. Some of them didn't have any contact with their personal tutor, particularly as I did the study during the COVID lockdown. So often they didn't see their tutor, or they certainly didn't see them face to face. But they felt shy maybe to request help. Some students had issues with identity, and if they were a female student, they would prefer a female tutor, for example. We looked at other supportive relationships, and by far the biggest other supportive relationship is friends, Chinese student friends. So they would contact friends and peers as their biggest source of support. They would have WeChat groups, help each other with homework, share resources, ask each other if it's worth going to see their personal tutor, etc. There are also other support services that I've mentioned on here that students found that they appreciated. For example, the English Language Centre, which is now, of course, our international college, and they spoke very highly of the library services and student wellbeing. Tutors in China advised their students of UK higher education. The students obviously were not familiar with it at the start, but the staff in the UK did help students to settle in and feel happy, although one student still felt a little like a stranger. So I witnessed different degrees of acculturation from the different students. Tutors did help students to find out about life in the UK. Some of them already possess capital to be able to deal with things, and they hoped for tutors' help in cultural issues. More personal relationships with Chinese tutors were reported, so they had a closer relationship with their Chinese tutors, but they wanted the PT in the UK to be able to help them to adapt to the culture. And there were some things around polite language. We tend to use things that are not so direct sometimes, and it's not always understood by international students. Students have a lot more freedom here in the UK, and so it's quite difficult sometimes for them to come to terms with how much freedom they do actually have. I witnessed quite a few different tutor and tutee emotions during the study, some of those positive, some of them were more negative. So some things like worry about attaining good grades, language anxiety, etc. So in this class, I'm going to describe the models that I found, and I've used the term model following the scientific use of the word. I'm not saying this is how it should be, I'm saying this is what I found. And the key to the models is there on the right. So I've got students, their peers, their personal tutors, and other support. So this is what I found in the UK personal tutoring system. In all of the models, the student's closest relationship is with their Chinese-speaking peers or family. The personal tutor was often on the periphery, or even in some cases not present at all, because maybe the student didn't know that they had a personal tutor. The first model is the conduit model, which is well documented in personal tutoring literature, first used by Sally Wootton in 2006. And supported by the findings of my study. So this is where the student uses their personal tutor to discover where to access support or help. So they will ask their personal tutor, and the personal tutor will direct them to different services or different people within the university. This also corresponded to what I found with the Chinese personal tutor. She described it as acting as a bridge, which is a similar kind of idea. I did find a few instances of the absent model, which is really sad that the student just didn't know that they had a personal tutor, or the tutor didn't contact the student, or for some reason they had been missed on the system and they weren't aware of or didn't have a personal tutor. So they just didn't obviously contact their tutor because they didn't know that they had one. So their closest relationship was with their peers, and maybe they would also contact other services within the university. This model is the network model. I made the names for these models myself, apart from the conduit model, so it's just what I termed it. So it's a network model where students would be aware of different support services within the university, and they would go to the most appropriate that they felt at the time. So the personal tutor would be a part of that network, but they wouldn't necessarily use them as a conduit. They would just go straight to the relevant support service or person. Students who exhibited this model appeared to have more cultural capital, so they knew where to go, they knew what services they should use, and they were more able to discern which person or service would be most appropriate to help them. This one is the proxy model, which is quite interesting because I found this to be relevant in a few cases. The student was unaware that they had a personal tutor, or they didn't have a functioning relationship with their personal tutor. So it may be that they did know that they had a tutor, but they didn't get on with them, or they had no contact with them, for example. So they would access information through their friend's personal tutor. So they would say, oh, well, my friend's got a personal tutor. So I ask my friend asks their personal tutor, and then they pass the information back on to me. So this could also apply to students who suffered from language anxiety and were afraid to contact their personal tutor because they perceived a barrier in their language. So they would ask their student friends, and then they would ask their tutor. So it's not an ideal situation, but it could be a method of reaching typically hard to reach students. So here I'll briefly return to the research questions. So we looked at the personal tutoring relationships in the UK, and again it was mainly Chinese speaking peers that are the support for students. And part of that network of support, so being from a collectivist culture, meant that students really looked to each other. In terms of their relationship in China, the boundaries, again, were an issue. There really weren't boundaries often between students and tutors. They would contact them at any time of day or night and expect a response from their tutor. Although there were expertise boundaries sometimes where tutors would refer to another service and act as a bridge. They would have a close relationship, visit their tutor's home. Some played football or sports with their tutors. They'd contact them via WeChat, and they had a really close relationship, which was more like a father or mother. And so sometimes when they come to the UK and we are not so close, we have those professional boundaries, they can feel disappointment with their UK personal tutor. However, the personal tutor could have a really important role helping students to transition into UK higher education. So we looked at transition theory and found that students would like tutors to help with acculturation because that's something that their peers can't help with. Now, if their peers are new to the UK as well, then they can't get that kind of help from their peers. So this is a place where tutors could step in and provide support for their students in this area. So how can we as personal tutors better support our Chinese students? One main thing is around managing expectations, outlining our roles and responsibilities, and being repeated throughout the year. So we all know about freshers overload. Students get a lot of information, so it's good to repeat it throughout the year, perhaps in personal tutoring sessions. Although students are from a collectivist culture, it's important that we don't view them as a homogenous group. They are not all the same. They might be from a collectivist culture, but they are individuals. And this is one reason why I used IPA, because it really looks into the individual experience of each student rather than kind of putting them all together in a group. The main tension for personal tutors was identifying the most appropriate level of support. What's too much? What's too little? This is a really good question. The aim, of course, of personal tutoring is to develop autonomy, so it's good to not be overly reliant, but students do need enough support. And personal tutors could find ways of supporting student networks, for example, directing them to a WeChat or a WhatsApp group, or helping them organise study groups. And this is a summary basically of the findings, the literature that I used to support those findings, and the recommendations. So again, managing expectations, really important. Supporting the network. I also looked at social identity mapping and using that to help students to transition into UK higher education. Training and information for personal tutors is really important. The cultural support element. Proactivity again was important, that tutors reach out to students because they may not always reach out to us. Familiarity, maybe assigning personal tutors to those who teach their tutees. Again, this is quite a controversial issue because some of them did prefer an independent person. But it's good to get familiarity with the personal tutor, however that is achieved. So choice of personal tutors as well. It's important that tutors are caring, that they care about their students and they're not just kind of going through the motions. And then PT part of curriculum could be a way to ensure that students come to personal tutoring sessions and get the most from their personal tutoring relationship. This was a very quick run through a lot of the things that I found. So please feel free to have a look at the actual thesis, or if you want any further details or conversation about it, I'm happy to be contacted by email, and there are the details on that slide. And finally, the references. There are more here than I actually put on the slides because I removed a lot of the slides, but I thought I'd leave the references there in case anyone found them useful. So thank you very much for your time. And do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions.